Welcome to Lesson 1.13, Exploring Risk Assessment Methodologies. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security and Risk Management domain, and we are in Key Area of Knowledge L, which is Understand and Apply Risk Management Concepts. Our topics will include risk assessment terminology, risk assessment approaches, and risk assessment methodologies. Let's start with risk assessment terminology. Now, the first terms we're going to go through are going to be a review, and then we're going to have a couple of new ones. So remember that a threat is a potential danger. A threat agent or a threat adversary was a specific instance of a threat. A vulnerability is a weakness. An exploit is when a threat agent successfully takes advantage of a vulnerability. Impact is the magnitude of harm that's created by a threat source. And likelihood occurrence is a weighted factor that a given threat agent is capable of exploiting a given vulnerability. These were all terms that we talked about in the last lesson. Residual risk is the amount of risk after controls are implemented, and inherent risk was the amount of risk before controls were implemented. So we're going to start with inherent risk. We may put some additional controls, and our residual risk, which is the one that we're really concerned with, is the amount of risk after controls are implemented. So we're going to be talking about how we assess risk in this lesson. The objective of a risk assessment is to identify the level of risk, and often that's referred to as either the severity of the risk or the dollar value of the risk. And in either case, whether we talk about severity, and severity is usually in descriptive terms of low, medium, high, or normal, elevated, and severe. Dollar value is obviously expressed in a dollar value. What we're trying to ascertain is the level of risk within the risk tolerance of the organization, or do we have to take some type of risk response or risk mitigation? So a core assessment process includes first determining the impact if the threat agent was successful, determining the likelihood of occurrence taking into consideration the control environment and known vulnerabilities, and then determining the level of risk. And regardless of what methodology we use, this is really what we're looking at during the risk assessment process. There are a number of different approaches to doing a risk assessment. The three standard ones, and the ones you'll be expected to know for your exam, are a qualitative risk assessment. And a qualitative risk assessment is scenario-based, and it uses very descriptive terminology, such as high, medium, and low. Now, when we say scenario-based, what we're saying is we're looking at a scope, and then we are looking at our threats, and we're saying what happens if this threat is able to exploit the vulnerability. But we're not putting any numeric values in place. What we're using are these descriptive terms. So the impact would be high, medium, and low. The likelihood, high, medium, and low. The risk level, high, medium, and low. Again, those terms of descriptive terms can change, but we're really using this terminology. Qualitative risk assessments are pretty common. The second, which is more difficult to do, but maybe a little bit more precise, is a quantitative risk assessment. And quantitative risk assessments assign numeric and monetary values to the elements of the assessment. So generally, a numeric value will be assigned to impact and to likelihood, and a monetary value is what's being assigned to the asset value and to the risk level. We're going to be doing both a qualitative and a quantitative risk assessment, so you can see the differences between the two. This one's a fairly challenging one because you have to be able to assign a value to the asset and very precise numeric values to both the impact and to the likelihood. Fairly common is doing a hybrid risk assessment, and in a hybrid risk assessment it incorporates both qualitative and quantitative components. So you may have just a mixture of using some descriptive terminology and some numeric values. So those are our three standard: qualitative and quantitative and hybrid. As I said, we're going to go through a qualitative and go through a quantitative to make sure that you understand both and that you know how to reach the appropriate conclusions. Now, there are a number of different risk assessment methodologies that focus on information technology and information security. Remember, risk assessments happen in all types of disciplines, certainly not just in information security. So there's different disciplines have different methodologies. But there are a couple that are really very focused on the areas that we're working on, which are technology and information security. The first is the NIST, remember National Institute of Standards and Technology, 800-30, Risk Management Guide for Technology Systems. So that's NIST SP, Special Publication, 800-30, the Risk Management Guide for Information Technology Systems. This is the risk management process, both risk management and risk assessment process, which is detailed within this guide, that federal agencies are expected to use. It's also really, really adaptable for the private sector, and when we go through our risk assessments, we're actually going to do one of them based on the 800-30 approach. The second is FRAP, that's a facilitated risk assessment process. The third is OCTAVE, which is the Operationally Critical Threat, Asset, and Vulnerability Evaluation. And the fourth is using the ISO, that's the International Organization for Standardization, 27005 guidance. So let's look at each of these individually. The NIST SP 800-30, the National Institute for Technology and Standards Risk Management Guide for Information Technology Systems, is documented in Special Publication 800-30. The methodology characteristics include that it is specific to information technology threats and the relationship to information security. So this methodology was designed from the ground up to incorporate information technology and information security. It is a qualitative approach. It is considered a U.S. federal government standard. The majority of federal government agencies are required to use this under FISMA, and it is very adaptable for use in the private sector. The second is FRAP. That's Facilitated Risk Assessment Process. It was developed by Thomas Pelletier. Its methodology characteristics include that it's used to analyze one system, application, or process at a time. So we use it in a very, very small scale, but it's also designed to be very fast and efficient. It stresses a lot of pre-screening activities. So before you do your risk assessment, there's a lot of pre-work that's done so that when you actually do your assessment, all of that has already been done and you can get right into the assessment phase. It also uses a qualitative approach. The next is OCTAVE, and that's the Operationally Critical Threat, Asset, and Vulnerability Evaluation method. It was developed at the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, the CISSP. It was really designed for the private sector, and its methodology characteristics are that it can be used for large scopes. So if you said, I want to do my entire organization opposed to an individual system, it should be noted that they also actually have a small business version of this. So it may be, in that case, it's a large scope for the small business. It uses facilitated workshops, which involve business process teams, and this also uses a qualitative approach. And lastly, we have the ISO 27005. The ISO 27005 standard provides guidelines for information security risk management. And its methodology characteristics is that it supports the requirements of an ISO 27000 information security management system. Now, the ISO family of guidance is proprietary, and you do need to pay for it, and you license it. Your organization can get certified as an ISO 27000 compliant organization. 27005 does not specify a specific methodology, but it does detail the very structured sequence of iterative processes. So let's take a quick look back at what we've been talking about. We started with our risk assessment terminology. We looked at our risk assessment approaches, our qualitative, our quantitative, and hybrid. We looked at risk assessment methodologies, so we looked at the NIST methodology, we looked at FRAP, we looked at OCTAVE, and we looked at the ISO 27005. And that brings us right into a match the meaning. So the terms that I want you to be very familiar with here are inherent risk, residual risk, qualitative, quantitative, NIST 800-30, OCTAVE, and impact. So take a few minutes, match the meanings that are on the right-hand side, the mixed up meanings on the right, with the terminology on the left. Put me on pause. When you're done, come on back and we'll go through this together. All right, inherent risk is the risk before controls are applied. The residual risk, which is what we're looking at when we do our risk assessment, is risk after controls are applied. Our qualitative means it's a scenario-based approach that we use descriptive terminology. So high, medium, and low, normal, elevated, and severe. But we're using descriptive terminology for our impact, for our likelihood, and to describe our risk levels. A quantitative is a numeric-based assessment approach. We're assigning numeric values to both our likelihood and our impact. We're assigning numeric values to the value of the asset as well as to the risk. NIST 800-30 is the Federal Government Risk Assessment Guide. It is required for organizations that need to follow FSMA. Octave is the methodology developed at the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, and it was designed for businesses. And lastly, impact is the magnitude of harm. And these are terms that you need to know for the exam: inherent risk, residual risk, qualitative, quantitative, NIST 800-30, Octave, and impact. Most people have a really hard time with qualitative versus quantitative. So you want to come up with some methodology in your head that will help you distinguish between the two. So we're going to end our lesson with some CISSP exam tips. Remember that the objective of a risk assessment is to identify the level of risk. That a hybrid risk assessment incorporates qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And the ISO 27005 standard provides guidance for information security risk management. In our subsequent lessons, we're going to be doing both a quantitative and a qualitative risk assessment. So we're going to dive deep into both of those so that you understand all of the components and will help you remember which type of risk assessment is which. So I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.